Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight's episode has been graciously sponsored by writer Kevin Gubernatis. He has written a very interesting book. It takes place in the far future, where all technology is fueled by sorcery. It also features a strong female heroine who is both powerful and likable, set in an expansive universe that's only going to grow. Here is the blurb. Contact has been lost with a deep space research station known as the Dark Star, orbiting a primordial black hole. The Covenant of Earth Nations has set a team of specialist commandos to discover the reason for this communications blackout. Along with these specialists, they have sent a young magician, Asala. She and her commandos are prepared for any situation involving entities, supernatural or mundane, or so they believe. Little do they know what awaits them aboard the Dark Star. It's far beyond anything anyone has ever experienced. A presence waits within the shadows, hungry and curious. Can Asala confront this terror and keep her commandos alive? Or will she, and all those in her charge, fall victim to the darkness? So there you have it, that's the blurb. It sounds like a really interesting fusion, this book. If you want to check it out, the link is at the top of the description in the video. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This is an encounter I had about 8 months ago. I was out for a drive this evening through some back roads outside my small urban town around 10:30 to 11 p.m. I've driven these roads dozens of times before, and I've never had an issue until tonight. Just a preface. There are little to no houses along these specific roads, and there's never traffic, so it's very isolated. I'm cruising around the twisty roads, enjoying myself and kind of in my zone, when I come over the crest of a right turn that goes up a hill, which then sweeps down into a flat left turn, which has a guardrail along the right side of the road. As I crest the hill, as I was going fairly slow, 40 to 50, as there are often deer or possums in the area, I notice a moving figure along the guardrail. I begin to slow some more, as I figure it's a deer and don't want to hit it. But as I get closer, I realize it's not a deer. It looks like a man. At this point, I'm barely moving, just creeping forwards to get closer to it. And I realize it's a man who's crouched down in a sort of Slav squat, and he's now turned around to look at me. In my headlights, the first things I notice are, he's not wearing any clothes, save for a pair of tidy-whities or an adult diaper. His eyes are oddly large for an adult man, and completely brown or black, and his skin was ghostly white. As I approached, I turned my brights on, and he didn't even flinch. By now, I've completely stopped, and started to reach down to get my phone, as I wanted to take a video. This was a huge mistake. I look away for a split second to grab my phone from the passenger seat, and as I'm starting to look down, he starts sprinting at me. He is running directly towards me. Shit. He gets up to my window and starts screaming, not just like a man yelling, but like all the rage he's ever felt is coming out at this moment, and it's directed at me. He starts pounding on the window with his fists, all the while screaming his head off. This lasts for about 3 seconds before I throw it into first gear and peel out, though it felt like a whole minute. As I'm accelerating, first gear in my car takes me to roughly about 40. I look in my rearview mirror and realize he's keeping up with me. It's not until I get it into second, then third, and take it up to 80 that I can see him no longer. He was running at inhuman speeds trying to keep up. I flew the rest of the way home, afraid to stop or look into my mirrors. I got in the driveway, ran inside, and typed this up. I have no idea what I encountered, but I did, and I hated every second of it. I'd be finding other routes to take when I take nighttime drives in future, just so that I don't ever meet him again. One of the scariest things that has ever happened to me was when I was hiking/climbing a mountain in the Adirondacks that I was unfamiliar with. My 2 friends were in much better shape at the time, and we ended up separated. They had been moving faster than I was and went on ahead. However, I came to a fork in the trail and had to guess which way to go. So I went left. Another mile or 2 later, another fork. That time, I went right. Miles kept going by, and the realization that I'm completely alone in a forest that I know very little about had hit me. I hadn't seen the map and was planning on relying on my friends. I'm thinking in my mind, maybe I should have gone right at the first fork, or maybe I should have gone right at the second fork. Where could they have been? I kept walking, listening for other hikers, road noises, anything really. I hear nothing but the sound of the forest. My water pack runs out. Dehydration begins to set in. My leg muscles started cramping along with my shoulders, and within about an hour my head is pounding. My hands are shaky, and I start to worry more. I keep walking, one foot in front of the other for hours. The sun is beginning to set. I don't know if I'm heading towards a road or civilization, or if I'm heading deeper into the forest. I keep going. My legs are so heavy. My head hurts so much. I'm so thirsty. Anxiety level is too high to think clearly. When I stop to rest, I only feel more tired, and it's harder to get my legs back started again. I stop to pee, and it's the darkest pee I've ever seen in my life. Just as the sun is about to set, I walk down onto a fire road. At first I'm excited, but then I realize I don't know if I should turn left or right. One way might take me further away from where I want to be. I turn right and start walking. The sun is setting and the forest is so dense it turns quickly dark. I keep walking. I have thoughts of thinking that I should give up. And I think, what does giving up look like? Will I just lay down on this fire road and go to sleep? Or lay down and die? Just having a conversation with myself as I go. I see a creek on the other side of the road. I stop and feel compelled to drink from it. It's moving water, slowly moving water, and I'm afraid that it might make me sick. Is it worth the risk? What if it makes me vomit, and I end up in even worse shape? I keep walking, moving slowly. So slowly. My feet are hurting, thighs are chafed raw, and sting so badly. My running shoes have worn through the skin on the back of my Achilles tendon. Blood has been seeping through my socks, and into my shoes. I hear a noise. I walk a little faster until I see a bed and breakfast. I walk right up to their front doors as if I own the place and plan to use their restroom and guzzle water for the sink. Perfect plan. "Excuse me, could you take a picture of us?" A very attractive woman approaches me with an expensive-looking DSLR camera in her outstretched hand. I don't answer, but found the camera already in my hand, as she was 5 steps away walking to her husband and 2 children, who were already posing in front of me. I'm so confused. I snap away, smile awkwardly, and she takes the camera out of my hand and says thank you, with a huge smile on her face. I wander inside and walk into the bathroom. I look in the mirror, and I've never looked so bad in my life. Pale and pasty skin. My lips were far too bright to be normal. Dirt on my face, all clothes soaked through with sweat. I lean my face into the sink and drink water until I could not drink anymore. I sat down on the front steps of this grand B&B and waited. I was glad I made it, but didn't know where I was and did not have my cell phone. Not that there was service there anyway. But about an hour later, there come my 2 friends walking down the same dirt road. We met up, walked to their car, and stopped at a diner to eat. I drank nearly a dozen glasses of water. I had a rather strange night a few years back, in 2013 roughly. Back then, I was visiting my uncle's house in a pretty low population area of northern Colorado that was founded in the early 1800s. There's a lot of dirt roads and a super old cemetery with graves from that century as well. We would go out there with the intention of ghost hunting in the cemetery and also finding new spots to explore, including a house where we've encountered a spirit telling us to audibly get out, right before we saw red eyes appear about 6 feet high in the doorway. Not being scared off, we continued to explore different spots, going up there almost every weekend for a few months. There were several strange events that we experienced, but definitely the strangest by far occurred one night while driving out there with my uncle and 3 of my cousins. The first part of the story happened at around 2 a.m. on a dirt road, about a 15-minute drive away from any form of civilization. So we're driving down the road and come to a bridge where there's a pretty fast-flowing river going underneath. So we decide it's a good spot to stop and check it out. Next to the bridge and river, there's a large grain field stretching way out to a small forest, maybe a half-mile away into the distance. You're able to walk into the field by way of a dirt path heading towards the forest. After walking around for a few minutes, watching the water and not really having anything happen, we're getting ready to go, and we see a small orange light appear in the middle of the grain, starting to slowly bob up and down, slowly coming towards us. Keep in mind that we're out in the middle of nowhere, and there's no homes or any form of civilization nearby for a few miles. So we see this light and get a little nervous, thinking maybe it's like a person out there who owned the land or something and were coming to tell us to leave. So we get back in the car and start to slowly drive away while watching the light. This strange thing about the light is it was square, almost looking like a lantern, and it seemed to come out of nowhere. So as we're slowly rolling away, the light starts to pick up speed towards us. I'm talking about at least 10 miles an hour fast, just moving through the grain field, so we're officially spooked at this point. and we start to drive faster away, and about a quarter of a mile down the road, my uncle's van just dies. All electronics go out and the engine shuts off, and we're just slowly rolling surrounded by silence, still able to see the light in the field, not slowly moving. So my uncle luckily gets the van started back up, and we fly out of there. Fast forward a week, we go back up there to the exact same spot to check it out during the day, and we get to the bridge and make a startling discovery. Under the bridge, where only a week ago there was a fast river flowing, it just dried up and was a narrow pathway where you could tell a river once was. The thing is, it looked like it had been dried up for years. After being confused for a minute, we decided that there was something strange afoot about this area, and that we should come back later at night to see what happened. So we go about our day and wait for it to get dark. At 1 AM, we headed back over to the spot, and the whole vibe everywhere was just super weird. So we pull up and shut off the van, and it takes us all about a second to muster up the strength to leave the car. One of my cousins and I decided to start to walk up the dirt path that leads alongside the grain fields towards the forest, pretty close to where we saw the lights that week before. We're just walking along, kind of bullshitting, trying to talk to each other and distract ourselves to not be nervous. We're walking along, and it's pretty quiet. There's nothing happening, and as I'm starting to pull my phone out to have it ready to record in case anything happened, we heard my uncle start yelling for us in a hurry, and to come back in a super concerned voice. So we turn around and we're maybe a little over of a quarter mile away from the car, and we start back, not in a hurry or anything, and maybe 5 seconds goes by and there's a loud sound that goes off towards the forest. I always have trouble explaining exactly how it happened, but it was just this deep roaring sound, almost exactly like the one you'd hear in COD Black Ops Zombies when you turn on the power in the theatre. Just like no normal animal or human sound I've ever heard before. Anyway, we heard the sound and take off running back at full speed towards the car. I covered that distance in less than 30 seconds, and I was back in the car with the door locked faster than I ever thought possible. After my cousin and I calmed down after a few minutes, we all get out of the car and tell my uncle and other cousin what we heard. He then told us the reason he called us to come back to the car in the first place was because he saw 3 lights shoot up in the sky right above our heads, and it freaked him out. After being shaken up, we decided to leave. As we're driving back home, we're all just talking about how weird the vibe was all night, and just as my uncle was saying something, we start to pass by something on the side road, and we're all like, what the hell is that? So we turned around and pulled over to get it out. There's just a car on the side of the dirt road, just flipped on its back with the window shattered, a fresh sign of an accident. We were checking if anyone was hurt, but no one was around. Again, we were miles into the middle of nowhere, and there was nowhere for anyone to go. Whoever crashed also left their purse behind, which we thought was strange. We checked the surrounding areas. No one was around to be found. So we called the cops and let them know about the accident and headed home. Some weird stuff happened while I was trying to sleep throughout the night. Like, through the window, I could see the lights outside keep turning on and off, and I was laying in the dark by myself in the living room. I didn't sleep until the sun got up. After doing some reflection, I wasn't sure what to make of the whole situation, and just figured it could be something like a spirit or a skinwalker or a Bigfoot or something. And it was maybe just a coincidence with the car accident, but I'm not sure. Now, I've kind of pieced together that it could be something like an alien encounter. Like the lights in the sky that my uncle saw, the weird inhuman scream, and the car could have been like an abduction site, where they bring the person back after some time and make them wake up thinking they were just in an accident. Only because it was just so sketchy how the car was perfectly intact, other than the windows being shattered, and the obvious fact that it was completely flipped over, and there was no second car or dented parts, like if a second car had flipped it over, and it was all flat land, so I couldn't make sense of the car. It couldn't have just flipped over by itself, and not be all destroyed or scratched or dented. It literally looked like someone picked it up, set it perfectly on the roof and just smashed out the windows. But that's my weird story, and I strongly feel like it had some sort of extraterrestrial encounter. I worked in the Idaho backcountry for a summer doing vegetation work and weed spraying. My co-worker and I shared a wall tent 20 miles away from any human and 60 miles from any town along a beautiful creek. We wouldn't see a soul for 10 or more days at a time. Part of our job was reading the journals of those who worked before us to get an idea past herbicide applications, whether weeds were last year and what kind. I often referred to the journal of one of the workers from the year prior, Andrew. According to his journal, he had to work a few days along because his co-worker Amy got sick and decided to pack out with some horsemen a few days before the hitch was over. The first day Andrew was alone, he saw a guy hiking who looked kind of ragged and dazed. His notes say that he looked super skinny and was maybe in his 60s. He says his name was Ray and that he was with a group, but Andrew hadn't seen anyone else, and Ray didn't have a backpack, but Andrew knew that there was a hunting camp 10 miles away that sometimes had visitors, so they parted ways. The first night alone went well. Andrew enjoyed having time to himself and took a creek bath and read his book. He had a productive next day, working, and decided to do a cool hike nearby that Amy wouldn't have done with him, but it took longer than expected. When Andrew got back to camp, it was dusk, and he saw the shadows from a fire flickering on the wall tent. He was confused. Had Amy come back? As he got closer, he saw that Ray was sitting there and had started a fire. Andrew asked what was going on, but Ray wouldn't speak and just kept staring at the flames. Andrew got out his radio and called the Forest Service, but it was too late on the evening for anyone to be on. He offered Ray some food, but he refused. It gets pretty cold there at night, so Andrew showed him to Amy's cot since she was gone, and they both fell asleep pretty quickly after that. According to Andrew's journal, he woke up in the middle of the night to Ray's screaming. He was naked on the cot, apparently having a night terror. He wouldn't wake up and was hysterical. He looked like a ghost. Andrew sat outside the rest of the night and dozed off. When he woke up, Ray was gone. He got a hold of the Forest Service and started walking around camp, keeping an eye out. Several hours later, a helicopter landed in the valley, and a bunch of police and dogs jumped out. Apparently, Ray had escaped the Idaho State Prison and had wandered into the wilderness for a week, looking to get to Montana. I later learnt that it was common for escaped prisoners to try to hike up the drainage where we worked to get out of Idaho. And as you might expect, many of those prisoners were violent offenders with mental disabilities. And of course, Andrew had just written this nonchalantly in his journal for me to read, at night, in that very same wall tent a year later. Definitely was on alert for a few days after that. I'm an American-born woman, but my mother was born in South Africa, having emigrated in the 90s. Growing up, she always taught me to be on guard and to be extremely cautious. It was simple things, like driving up to an ATM at night. While my mum was using the machine, I had to look out of one window while my sister would look out of the other, so that we could see if someone was coming. I had always wanted to visit South Africa, and when I was 17, I went as a graduation present. I always ended up staying with my grandparents, who were both in their late 70s. My grandmother was hell-bent on showing me as much of the country as possible, even though my grandfather had Alzheimer's and was worsening, and traveling was becoming harder. Regardless, we took off from Johannesburg towards Cape Town. We would drive for up to 6 hours at a time. Anyone who has been to South America knows that you can go hundreds of miles and see nothing but grass. But it was incredibly beautiful and eerie. Once we drove into wine country in the Cape. We began passing signs that said "Don't pull over" for people selling grapes, as we were near vineyards and people would steal grapes and then sell them on the side of the road. About hours 3 and 4 of the day, my grandfather was getting antsy. He was obsessing with the GPS in the car, plugging it in and re-plugging it in, cursing and getting infuriated. Eventually the thing just kept repeating, recalculating, for hours on end. My patience was wearing thin, and I was trying to take it from him so that I could fix it, but he wouldn't let me touch it. Finally, my grandmother had enough and pulled over so that he could give it to me. The stretched out road was narrow and lined by trees. It was probably mid-afternoon, but we were the only car in sight and it was silent. My grandparents were reading the GPS instructions and arguing when my grandmother turns around. "Keep watching out of the back window." I kind of smiled to myself, remembering that's what my mum used to do. I glanced at my phone, which had no service, and scrolled through my camera roll for the 300th time that day. I casually looked up and turned towards the back window, and my heart stopped. A man had come out of the trees and was running at full sprint to our car. I found my voice and yelled, "Go!" to my grandmother, and her instincts kicked in and we drove off. We drove away, and the man was just left standing there. My grandmother explained that often, when travelers pulled over for grape sellers, there would be people waiting in the trees who would come out and rob you, sometimes violently. It doesn't get much more vulnerable than a teenage girl and an elderly couple, one of which was suffering from Alzheimer's. Thank you, Mum, for making me cautious. And I think I'm going to stay away from the forests from now on. In Idaho, there's this natural hot springs up on top of a mountain. It's at the end of a dirt road and up a trail. It's not very well known. A buddy and I decided to spend a few days camping up there, so we set up camp at the trailhead. While we're making dinner, we see a car pull up and 4 kids in their 20s get out, all dressed in swimwear. They walk past us and wave, then head up the trail. A few hours go by and it's probably 6 p.m. and starting to get dark in winter. So my buddy and I grab a bottle of scotch and head up the trail, fully expecting to join the other group in the hot springs. We get up there and there's no one in the hot springs. Sandals and towels all strewn about the area, but no people. We thought it was weird, but figured they all went into the woods to collectively pee or something. We spent 2 hours in the springs and never saw any signs of them. We went back to camp at 1 a.m. and their car was still there. We woke up in the morning and the car and clothes were gone. No idea what they were doing though. This story happened to my girlfriend. Her and a few friends, 2 gals and a guy, went camping to a remote place in the woods for fun. It was like a little turnout near a random forest service road. The guy friend, who I will refer to as Manly Man, was actually a scaredy twip and hated sleeping in the woods, but for whatever reason loved being out there. In order to alleviate his fears, he brought a dose of sleeping aid, either Ambien or OTC Benadryl. I can't remember which. Fast forward to around dusk. They're enjoying a fire and generally jesting when a truck rolls up, lifted, loud, you know the type. One guy gets out the passenger truck door and another stays in the cab. They want directions to somewhere that no one's ever heard of and want to use a phone since they have no service. After being told no one else has service, he proceeds to ask questions like, "Just you 4 up here? Did you know there were bears? There aren't any in Oregon Valley. Are you carrying protection from wild animals?" Rather annoying and innocuous stuff, until fast forward again to the middle of the night, when Manly Man is thoroughly knocked the hell out, and headlights pop up in the road. An engine rolls closer. My girlfriend wakes up spooked, and the engine stops and the headlights cut. There's no noise for a few minutes, then rustling. My girlfriend wakes up. They all start freaking out and are trying to rouse the Manly Man. Eventually he wakes up, groggily agrees that this rustling is real, and he's a bit nervous. They listen for a while longer, and after the noise gets closer they start shouting, "Who's there?" and receive no reply, and the rustling stops. Needless to say, they threw their camping stuff in the back of the truck and got the hell out. They passed the same truck a bit down the road with no one inside. Either those 2 pricks were playing a prank, or legit up to some shitty, shady things. But either way, not how you want to be woken up in the middle of nowhere. They ended up crashing at Manly Man's house in the living room and playing Risk the next day. My friends and I all wanted to visit an abandoned school because we thought it would be very creepy and fun. We drive, and once we get there, we see a full-blown bonfire and thought that they were kids like us looking for a creepy night out. We were wrong. Apparently it was a gang initiation going on. They stopped us, asked if we had any drugs, alcohol, or money. The driver, my best friend, was frozen with fright, and they tried to pull him out of the driver's seat. I was sitting behind him and trying to talk some sense into him to get the car to drive off. No dice. He sat there frozen. A huge gangster put his hand into the car and tried to unlock my door. I blocked his hand, and he immediately started punching the window. Finally, my best friend kicked into gear and slammed the car into reverse and put the pedal to the metal. I was so relieved. For a few seconds, everything was in slow motion. He even hit the guy trying to get the door open. Then he hit a boulder behind us. The car jerked and came to a stop, and luckily the car didn't hit a ditch and we sped off. We were so lucky. The path to the abandoned school was on a mountain road, and we could have easily fallen into a ditch when he was heading back. We laughed about it, but my friend had to replace his door and his trunk. I was working on a construction site, on a greenfield site in the UK, next to an elevated section of the M6 motorway in northwest England. Because of the proximity to the motorway during the main groundwork phase, we had to work at night, between midnight and 4 AM, as the motorway had to be closed for periods during work, because there had to be vibration monitoring in place on the motorways. I was project manager, so was working night shift along with the construction crews, so I was mostly just milling around rather than working. And the job was small, so there was only around 5 of us on site, including me. It was winter, so it was a pretty miserable environment. One of the construction workers sent for a cigarette, and they came back, pretty quickly as white as a sheet, and they'd said that they'd heard a woman crying in her pajamas in the woods. We all just laughed it off, but then someone else mentioned they thought they'd seen it when standing in a farmer's field near the site, while he was driving to the site but didn't mention it, that it happened, and thought he was mistaken. So by this point we're all starting to get pretty spooked. We turn on the main compound lights. We only had the immediate area lit up, and had hand torches, as we had restrictions on the amount of light that we could have during the next night working. And when we turned on the lights, we saw about 5 women wearing gowns and pajamas of various ages at the end of the light, not far from our side. And then they bolted into the woods. That basically freaked out the group. A few of us went back to the main access track and followed it along the direction they had run off in, but we came across a spooky looking 1-lane wide tunnel, and were basically like, screw going in there. The road was just a private access track and had no street lighting or anything, so it was pretty scary. So we packed up the cars and left the site straight away to return in the morning. After a bit of investigation the following day, we found out a little further along the road from the turnoff from the site that it was a transitional rehabilitation unit for women. Basically, a private specialist residential hospital for people recovering from physical and psychological brain trauma. Things like acute brain trauma caused by car clashes to serious cases of PTSD and schizophrenia. Acute bipolar 2. And other neurological issues too, as they had friends who worked in the hospital and wondered at night what would make them select them. My parents lived out in the country for a time, so as a kid growing up, it was really easy to get paranoid at night. All those wide open spaces and dark woods can seem ominous, but eventually you just get sort of used to it and tune it out. My sister and I would sometimes fall asleep in the living room watching a late night TV program. Sometimes I would wake up to the sounds of footsteps on our deck in the dead of night, when no one would have been outside. My sister would sometimes see a shadowy figure for a brief moment, which always seemed to draw nearer when she could see it again. Eventually, whatever it must have been entered the house, because one day I closed every door in the entire house, as it was a very large single-story ranch house, to keep our dog from getting into certain areas. When I came home, every single door on the inside of the house was wide open, along with the door I exited when locking up. I was worried there was a home intruder, but nothing else was missing. When I was 17 or so, 2 friends and I decided to camp in the field next to my housing estate so that we could drink beer and listen to music as loudly as we wanted to. This was a huge grassy field on a slight hill, where all the surrounding houses were far away enough so that they wouldn't disturb the neighbors, and we couldn't be seen by anyone unless they were extremely close to our tent. It became late, and my 2 friends had fallen asleep. I was having trouble sleeping around that time, so I lay awake for hours just thinking. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard the distinct sound of grass and vegetation, and someone walking around outside our tent. I was stunned with terror there, but more so because I hadn't heard anyone approaching. Just suddenly, there was someone outside the tent. I held my breath out of fear and shock, which is when I heard another set of footsteps belonging to the dog by the sound of it. Filled with dread, I just lay there as still as possible, breathing slowly and quietly, listening to this person and his dog walking outside back and forth on the tent. I thought we were going to get shot or beaten by this dude. Then I saw this guy's shadow, which freaked me out a hell of a lot more than I already was. It was huge and looming over us, and every time he passed our tent, I couldn't see the dog's shadow, even though I heard it making increasingly erratic situations of the tent. This carried on for another 5 minutes, although it felt like much more time had passed. The shadows disappeared, and the sounds faded away. They didn't leave or anything. It was more like they were still walking outside of the tent, but with perpetually lighter footing, and there was no threat for me to come outside. I freaked out at my friends and said we had to go because someone knew we were here and they didn't believe me, thinking I had been asleep as well, and said that I had dreamt the whole thing. I assured them I haven't, and that we had to leave right now. They tried to get back to sleep, ignoring me because they're lazy as hell and didn't want to pack anything else up. So I gave up, even though I know that I'd never be able to sleep. 10 minutes later, the sound returned just like the volume outside had been turned up gradually. It felt like the same dread I had before, and whispered one of my friends' names so that they could actually hear, and "Shh," one lady said. They had already heard and told me to open the tent to see who was terrorizing us. I did so, slowly easing my hand out of the sleeping bag and up to the zipper. It probably took 5 minutes for me to reach it. It was so high, and I didn't want to make the sound. So I pulled it out so violently, I nearly ripped the bag in half. There was nobody there, and we got about a meter within the place of 5 seconds. And also, there was nobody nowhere. As I mentioned, we kept atop a hill in the middle of a field, and so could be seen by anyone who had decided to run. But there was nothing. Even though it was impossible for anyone to escape me seeing them, I'm absolutely positive there were no footsteps outside our tent that night. I was hunting in the middle of Missouri with my uncle and dad. We were about 4 miles from the truck and 30 miles from civilization. I was sitting at the campfire while my uncle and dad went to get more firewood. I had a gun sitting next to me. I was cooking some fish we caught in a nearby pond on the fire and was close to dozing off. I heard footsteps and looked up to see a guy in orange walking towards me with a smile on his face that looked off. He began about 25 yards from me, and I couldn't make out why he was wearing all safety orange. I shouted at him and asked if he needed help. He began to walk faster, and that's when I saw his limp. His right pant leg was covered in blood, and the fabric was torn. He kept walking towards me, and I picked up my gun and pumped it. He kept right on going, and I pissed my pants. He was about 15 feet from me before I heard shit. My uncle had just dropped a piece of wood in his foot and yelled. The guy immediately turned and ran into the woods. Turns out he escaped from prison earlier that day and was found dead in the woods, half eaten by animals a few days later. We left as soon as they got back. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Like I said at the start, if you would like to check out the book, The White Wolf and the Darkness, you can find the link at the very top of the description to check it out. It's very well worth a read, and I think a lot of you will enjoy it. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to drop a like and leave a comment with your thoughts, as it always goes a long way. If there's a story that you would like to share, please don't forget that you can send it to my email or post it to my Reddit, either are fine. Please just be generous with your descriptions, paragraphing, and punctuation, as that maximizes the chance of your story being read. But for now, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.